By ratifying the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities in 2009, Ukrainian government committed to protect the rights of persons with disabilities, including rights to education that are outlined in Article 24. However, access to higher education for students with disabilities hasn't become a recognized priority in Ukraine yet. Enrollment of certain categories of citizens in higher education institutions remains unrepresentative of the general population. In the 2013-14 education year, the total number of students at all four levels of higher education in Ukraine was 2,053,000. Yet, there were only less than 13,000 students with disabilities among them. The terminology used in Ukraine in relation to people with disabilities and special needs in education has reflected some of the social movement in the area and deserved examination. Up to the end of the 18th century, the following Ukrainian words were used to refer to people with disabilities: kalika, cripple; chromets, lame; slipets, blind; nem, deaf. Then the word invalid in Ukrainian was borrowed from French. Invalid was first used to identify war veterans only, and was then extended to mean any person with physical or mental disability. In Ukraine, the differentiation in terminology relating to the disability is still based on the ability to work, or the severity of the illness or disability, which reflects the following logic: disability leads to inability to work, which leads to social deficiency. Describing this scenario in Ukraine during the Soviet times, Malofeyev states that for decades the inherent problems faced by children with disabilities were recognized only by their families and those professionals charged with determining the course of their lives. Although Ukraine developed its legislation in alignment with United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, where the term disabled child was used, the term child invalid was common for most Ukrainian legislation throughout the 21st century. The changes in terms used reflect the evolution in legislation and changes in the society's awareness of the problem. The terms that were used in laws, decrees, orders, and regulations by year include 91 child invalid, 96 children who need correctional of mental or physical development, 2001 children with limited abilities, 2013 children with invalidity, children with special needs, 2014 children with special educational needs, and it was first defined in the law on education. The variety of terms attests to the confusion among politicians and misunderstanding of the term and issue of inclusion by the government. It also demonstrates the dynamics of Ukraine striving to conform to European norms and values. In 1999, the Ministry of Education of Ukraine and the Academy of Pedagogical Sciences issued the paper Concept on Special Education State Standards for Children with Special Needs, intended to outline the reform of special education. The concept paper admitted that special schools were insufficient in the providing services to the children with special needs, and the children with special needs should receive additional instructional support in the regular curriculum classroom. In terms of legislation, advancements to develop inclusive education during the period between 2011 and 2014 were very intensive. About 20 different regulations concerned inclusive schooling in the general school settings, including organizational issues, curricular assessment loads, and provision of psychological support, pedagogy, and new staff to assist the general school teacher with inclusive schooling. The world's of secondary education and higher education are fundamentally different with respect to educating students with special needs and/or disabilities. While secondary education is compulsory and no student with a disability may be excluded, access to higher education is selective and many aspirants do not get admitted. Higher education may also release students with special needs or disabilities for poor academic performance, while secondary education may not. For decades, students with special needs have been disadvantaged in terms of accessing higher education. In most higher education institutions in Ukraine, the infrastructure and training of teaching staff does not allow for the participation of students with disabilities. Moreover, the Russian annexation of the Crimea and Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine have posed additional challenges to ensuring access to post-secondary education in the temporarily occupied territories and for internally displaced people, including many people with special needs. For many years, children with developmental problems, sensory disorders, brain dysfunction, and complex disorders were marginalized in the Ukrainian secondary educational system. These children were educated in a separate special school system consisting of institutions, many of which operated at boarding schools for children who lived too far from school to commute every day. Children with the severe mental or physical disorders were totally excluded from the special school system and were fostered by institutions belonging to the Ministry of Social Policy. According to the law on education, the system of special education includes general boarding schools for children who need special care, special schools for children who need correction of mental or physical development, general education sanatorium schools for children with poor health who need long-term medical treatment. However, none of the titles of the currently existing special schools identify any specific special needs of disability. In Ukraine, three different ministries are charged with the responsibility for children with disabilities, each ministry having its own schools, rehabilitation and medical centers and facilities. You can see them on the screen. Each ministry pursues its own goals. The Ministry of Education and Science offers educational and correctional services. The Ministry of Social Policy pursues social care and renders support and social assistance in everyday living. The Ministry of Health focuses on health care issues. The population of children with disabilities has been constantly growing, but the conditions in special schools have been worsening with every year, caused by insufficient government funding. However, financing was improved significantly when responsibility for special education schools was transferred from local to oblast authorities. For decades, children were put in special institutions, sometimes without special assessment and even without the parents' consent. In many cases, parents had to withstand significant pressure from state officials if they rejected the special institution services. Because of the international agreements and conventions on human rights, the situation is slowly changing. Special education, social protection of children with disabilities, integration and inclusion of the disabled children in general, and special education are slowly gaining more national attention. The model of inclusive higher education was first developed at the Open International University of Human Development, Ukraine. However, Ukraine still lacks a national concept for inclusive higher education that would ensure continuous educational services to disabled people. Most of all disabled students study at the University Ukraine and its 20 countrywide local branches. Students with disabilities studying in many other higher educational institutions may receive broadly variable services or, in some cases, none at all. The greatest concern that university faculty express about their disabled graduates' future is that society is not prepared to accept qualified disabled people as equals and might ignore their needs and marginalize them again. According to the President's decree of June 2005, among the priority measures to be taken to provide conditions for disabled persons was the building of ramps in all educational institutions, provision of academic support, availability of professional care staff, and support with day-to-day living intended to meet challenges which disabled students and faculty experience in the classroom and on campus. Raver stated that the notion of systematically providing accommodation for university students with disabilities is foreign to most instructors in Ukraine, colleges and universities. Instructors tend to be at a loss as to how to facilitate learning and evaluate students with disabilities. Some immediately assume that students with visible disabilities such as cerebral palsy or blindness will not be able to manage the academic demand of higher education. Official statistics says that more than almost 15% of Ukrainian children have special education needs. However, they constitute only 1% of the total number of students at vocational school and all less than 0.5% of university students. Most people with restricted mobility who are physically able and mentally capable of attending higher educational institutions can't do so because of the lack of such basic facilities as ramps and elevators in the previously built premises. Several attempts by the Ministry of Education have made to improve the situation in higher education. In 2006, the ministry issued a ministry order number 504 on enrollment and education of students with restricted physical abilities, which authorized several higher educational institutions to start enrolling deaf and hard of hearing students, but only in 7 professions. As a result of that step, the number of deaf students increased. However, it again started declining because of the new procedure of admitting students based on the ZNO, external independent testing procedure, which replaced the system of entrance examinations. Another attempt to improve access to the higher education for individuals with special needs was made in the form of the so-called experiment regarding the organization of integrated education for persons with special educational needs in the higher education institutions by the Ministry of Education in 2012. This experiment authorized 13 another universities and colleges to start enrolling students with different disabilities and special needs, and provided additional funding. However, no information has been officially published yet on the results of the planned 3-year experiment. The last point of my presentation is about the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. On November 1st, 2016, a new administrative department named Service for Students with Disabilities was launched. Its idea is based on the experience of Western universities. This project is meant to adapt the university educational environment and social infrastructure to the needs of special students and not vice versa as common in Ukraine. In summary, Ukraine continues in its efforts to conform to European disabilities law. However, the mechanisms to implement and enforce this law are largely ineffective. To reform the special education system and make inclusion a reality, the law has to be economically sustained and have community support. Further, it is necessary to coordinate the work of all relevant ministries to pursue the national policy and involve the other interested groups that can render assistance in removing the barriers to inclusion in the system of higher education. In addition, success in implementing inclusive practices at the secondary educational level is almost a precondition for the achievement of positive changes in the system of post-secondary education of individuals with disabilities and or special needs.